The moment Kash Patel tried to belittle Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, he had no idea what was coming. He threw around his national security titles like a shield, expecting deference, not questions. But Crockett didn't blink. She didn't shout. She waited, calm, razor-sharp, and ready. And when her turn came, she dropped one sentence so devastating, so surgically precise, the entire room froze. Not a single person moved, not even Patel. If you've ever watched someone in power try to silence truth, this moment will hit home. Like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, have you ever stood your ground when someone tried to dismiss you? It wasn't just another congressional hearing. It was the kind of morning where the walls themselves felt tight with anticipation. The House Oversight Committee chamber, an old, polished room with deep wood tones and heavy chandeliers, was packed from floor to ceiling. You could smell the nerves on the interns, hear the hushed shuffles of notepads, and feel the heat of political theater building like steam behind a sealed door. The subject on paper was classified materials and national security. Daesh. But anyone paying attention knew the real reason people tuned in. Kash Patel was testifying, and Jasmine Crockett was on the roster. Patel entered the room like he owned it. Dark suit, crimson tie, perfectly folded pocket square, and that air of Washington confidence that comes not from humility, but from having been too close to power for too long. His resume was impressive. Senior roles in defense and intelligence, a former Trump loyalist, a man who had briefed presidents and walked classified corridors. And he made sure everyone knew it. From the first question, he leaned into condescension, like it was second nature. With all due respect, he kept repeating, a phrase that, as usual, meant none at all. And then, on the other side of the panel, sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, 43 years old, former civil rights attorney, first term in Congress. Calm, deliberate, wrapped in a sharp purple blazer that didn't just stand out, it signaled she wasn't there to blend in. Some underestimated her because she didn't lead with volume, but anyone who had followed her career knew that when she got quiet, something was about to explode. She didn't interrupt. She didn't flinch. She just listened, carefully, measuring every word Patel spoke like an attorney logging contradictions in a deposition. The hearing room was full, but it was the silence that filled the space between them that made the air electric. Seniors watching from home, those who had lived through Watergate, Iran-Contra, 9/11, could feel the buildup in their gut. They recognized the signs. This wasn't going to be a debate. This was a cross-examination. Patel spoke with flair, repeating buzzwords like national security, presidential authority, and deep state. He name-dropped his roles and scoffed at oversight. "I've served my country at the highest levels," he said, "while some members of this committee are still figuring out how Congress works." He didn't look at Crockett when he said it, but everyone in the room knew exactly who that jab was for. Still, she said nothing, just calmly clicked her pen once and set it down. The camera panned to her face, neutral, but her eyes burned with the kind of precision that only a seasoned trial lawyer could summon. In the gallery, a retired federal judge whispered to his wife, "He has no idea what she's about to do." The hearing continued. More questions from both sides. Patel danced around answers, called legitimate questions partisan distractions, and presented himself as a patriot under siege. His defenders on the committee nodded in agreement. But Crockett? She sat still, letting him build his own narrative, brick by shaky brick. Because what Patel didn't realize, and what viewers across America were beginning to sense, was that every boast, every deflection, every smug dismissal wasn't rattling Crockett. It was fueling her. And by the time she took the microphone, she wasn't just prepared, she was locked in. The chairman tapped his gavel once, more ceremonial than directive. "Congresswoman Crockett, you have the floor." She didn't rush. She didn't adjust her mic like others did. She simply leaned forward, folded her hands, and took a breath. Then, in a tone that could have passed for a casual conversation at a kitchen table, she began. "Mr. Patel, I want to thank you for being here today. I know you've had quite the career, intelligence, defense, the works. And I've listened closely to everything you've said this morning. Very closely." Patel nodded, wearing the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. A smile that said, "I've handled tougher." A smile that was about to disappear. Crockett picked up a single sheet of paper, one page, typed in bold, and held it gently between her fingers like it was nothing special. But those watching could see it. That paper was loaded. I want to ask you about an interview you gave on September 12th on Fox News. You said, and I quote, "The documents were declassified through the appropriate channels. I was involved. It was all by the book." Is that still your position? Patel straightened, eyes flicking to the Republican side of the dais. Yes, Congresswoman, it is. Crockett nodded slowly, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. Great, because I also have a transcript of your sworn deposition before the House Intelligence Committee last year. And in that deposition, you stated under oath, and again, I quote, "I have no direct knowledge of declassification procedures being followed. I was not part of any formal process." Though, she let the words sit in the room for a moment. No added commentary, just silence. Patel's smile faded. "Would you like to reconcile those two statements for the record?" she asked softly. He cleared his throat. "Well, context matters. In public interviews, you're speaking generally. In depositions, you're constrained by legal boundaries. Different audiences, different expectations." Crockett tilted her head just slightly. "So, truth depends on who's listening?" A ripple ran through the room. It wasn't laughter. It wasn't outrage. It was awakening. The realization that something had cracked open, that the polished testimony was losing polish fast. "With all due respect," Patel began, defaulting to his earlier tactic, "you're twisting my words." "I'm quoting your exact words," she responded evenly. "One you gave to the public, the other under oath. Which one should we believe?" "I resent the implication," Patel snapped, a little too quickly. "I've spent my entire career protecting American interests. I don't need to be lectured by someone who—" She raised her hand gently, not to silence him, but to draw the line. "I didn't ask about your career, Mr. Patel. I asked about your words, and whether we, the American people, can trust them." At home, viewers across the country leaned closer to their screens, especially the older ones. Veterans, retired attorneys, people who had testified in courtrooms and knew the stakes of perjury. They recognized what was happening. Crockett wasn't just asking questions. She was walking Patel into a box he couldn't escape. She flipped the page. June 3rd, you signed a certification stating all classified materials had been returned to the National Archives, but subsequent searches found more than a dozen additional boxes, some in unsecured storage, some in private residences, even one in a guest bathroom. Is that proper handling of classified material? Patel's eyes narrowed. That's not how we define security protocols. There were Secret Service personnel. The Secret Service protects people, Crockett interrupted, not paperwork. Boom. That was the first audible gasp, a short, sharp intake of breath from someone near the back of the room, followed by stunned silence. Crockett continued, unbothered. You've said repeatedly that your role was advisory, that you didn't pack boxes or transport documents, yet you certified their return. So I'll ask again, did you verify the contents of those boxes before signing your name? That's not how these things work, he answered, clearly rattled now. You rely on your team. You trust the process. Crockett leaned forward ever so slightly. Mr. Patel, were you trained in the proper handling of classified materials? Yes. And in that training, were you taught to certify material without direct knowledge of its content or location? His mouth opened, then shut, then opened again. No. There it was. No yelling, no table pounding, just a quiet, undeniable corner that Patel had walked himself into, and Crockett had closed it behind him. Thank you, she said softly, returning the paper to her folder. The moment didn't need a finale. It was done, and yet it would echo. The stillness that followed Crockett's final words felt sacred. No rustling of papers, no whispered sidebars, just a silence that stretched long enough to feel eternal inside that ornate, historical room. Even the chairman seemed frozen, as if unsure whether to signal the next questioner or just let the moment breathe. Kash Patel, a man whose entire career had been built on navigating tense power rooms, stared down at his water glass, the ripples inside it betraying the tremble in his fingers. The confidence he had carried like armor all morning now hung loosely around his shoulders like an ill-fitted coat. But Crockett wasn't done, not quite. She leaned in, not with aggression, but with that uniquely devastating calm that only comes from truth held in reserve. The kind of calm that military veterans recognize from commanders about to drop orders. The kind of calm that courtroom lawyers use when they know they've cornered the witness, and all that remains is the summary. "Mr. Patel," she said, voice steady, "I've reviewed your sworn statements, your interviews, your written certifications, and I found something consistent, not in the facts, but in the way you dodge them." A few heads turned. The C-SPAN camera zoomed just slightly. "You stand on your record like it's a shield," she continued, "but shields don't hide lies. They magnify them." Patel opened his mouth, but Crockett kept going. "You've told us the documents were returned, but they weren't. You told the public you oversaw the declassification, but under oath, you said you didn't. You certified truth on paper, then claimed ignorance on record." And then she paused. For the first time in over an hour, she looked down, not to her notes, but at her hands. She rubbed her thumb across a ring, a gesture, a beat, a breath. "Watch. When I practiced law in Texas," she said slowly, "I had a client, a young man, not perfect, but trying. He got caught in a mess bigger than he understood, signed papers he hadn't read, trusted the wrong people. The DA tried to bury him, 20 years, for a mistake. And all because no one ever told him that truth, when not told fully, still counts as a lie." She looked up again. "And that's why I don't play games with sworn statements." Patel shifted in his seat. A drop of sweat rolled from his temple. "You've repeatedly questioned my qualifications," she said. "You've dismissed my experience because I'm new to Washington. But let me tell you what experience teaches you." And here it came. "It teaches you to recognize when someone isn't answering to truth, but to ego, and that, Mr. Patel, is exactly what this is." The hearing room was still. The lights overhead buzzed faintly. Somewhere in the back, a young staffer exhaled sharply. And then she said it. One sentence, 21 words that would go viral within minutes and be replayed across cable news and TikTok reels for weeks. "Mr. Patel, I may be new to Congress, but I've spent enough time in courtrooms to recognize perjury when I see it." Boom. The impact was immediate. Patel sat back like he'd been slapped, his jaw working to form a rebuttal, but finding no traction. The chairman's gavel didn't drop. It didn't need to. No one in the room was speaking. The moment didn't just land. It echoed. A New York Times reporter scribbled a single sentence into her notebook. "This will lead." A retired judge watching at home texted his grandson one word: masterclass. A legal affairs professor at Georgetown paused his own lecture, rewound the live stream, and played it again. Patel, still stunned, reached for his water, his hand shaking now without disguise. His voice, when it returned, was a whisper compared to the booming confidence he had displayed earlier. I reject that characterization." But the room had already moved on, or rather, it hadn't needed to. Crockett had said what no one else had dared, with surgical accuracy, with emotional weight, with the legal clarity of someone who wasn't guessing, she knew. She folded her notes, clicked her pen. "I yield back," she said. And the room? It stayed silent a beat longer. When Crockett yielded the floor, it wasn't just the end of a round of questioning. It was the emotional crest of something deeper. You could feel it in the air. No one moved. No one cleared their throat. The hum of the room had shifted from argument to reckoning. Kash Patel sat frozen, shoulders no longer squared, spine not quite straight. It wasn't that he'd been outmaneuvered by skill. It was that he'd been seen, and the country was watching. Outside the hearing room, phones were already buzzing. C-SPAN's live stream had hit a viewership spike usually reserved for presidential testimonies. On X, the clip of Crockett's 21-word sentence had been posted by 3 reporters before Patel had even finished blinking. One outlet called it the most devastating line ever uttered in a congressional hearing. Hashtags like Perjury Patel, Just Crockett Crushes, and Just Truth Under Oath began trending within the hour. But inside the chamber, silence was still king. The next congressman, an older Republican from Indiana, was handed the floor. He looked down at his prepared notes, glanced over at Patel, and for a moment, visibly reconsidered whether to proceed with what had now become a flat, irrelevant line of questioning. I'll reserve my time, he finally said. And just like that, the tone of the hearing was reset. Patel answered no more questions with confidence. The stammer replaced the swagger. To the best of my recollection, became his lifeline. I can't confirm that at this time, was repeated like a mantra. But it was too late. The narrative had already changed. Crockett hadn't just confronted him, she had defined the moment, and in doing so, pulled the truth into the open without ever needing to raise her voice. Later that evening, every major network played the clip during prime time. MSNBC called it a masterclass in composed accountability. CNN ran a 5-minute segment comparing Patel's pre-questioning arrogance to his post-questioning collapse. Even Fox News struggled to spin it, with one panelist quietly conceding, she came prepared and he didn't. But it wasn't just the media talking. It was the public. In barbershops and retirement communities, in law school classrooms and Sunday potlucks, people rewatched it. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Older viewers in particular, those who had lived through decades of political grandstanding, felt something rare. Justice not delayed, not abstract, but seen. Tangible. Real. Crockett herself didn't tweet that night. She didn't go on a media tour. Instead, she left the Hill quietly and went home to her small D.C. apartment. She changed into sweatpants, reheated leftover chicken, and called her mother. I just told the truth, she said. Her mother replied, you did more than that. You gave people something to believe in again. Meanwhile, Patel's team scrambled. Scheduled TV interviews were canceled. A draft op-ed intended to defend his conduct was pulled. The fallout wasn't legal, at least not yet. It was reputational, and for a man whose entire currency was credibility, that collapse was louder than any headline. In a small town in Tennessee, a retired judge wrote in his church newsletter, today, a young Congresswoman made it clear that no one, not even a seasoned insider, gets to lie without consequence. And she did it without anger, without insult. She did it the old-fashioned way, with facts. Crockett returned to the Capitol 2 days later, to a standing ovation from staffers and an unusual number of quiet nods from colleagues across the aisle. Not because they all agreed with her politics, but because they respected her conduct. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful fallout of all. Not the headlines, not the virality, but the unshakable realization that in an age of noise, the quietest voice in the room had just told the loudest truth. 2 days after the hearing, a handwritten letter arrived at Congresswoman Crockett's office. It was from a retired schoolteacher in Birmingham, Alabama, 83 years old, born in the segregated South. I watched what you did, it read. And I want you to know I stood up from my chair and clapped. You didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for everyone who's ever been told they weren't enough. That letter wasn't the only one. Hundreds more followed. Handwritten notes, emails, voice messages, messages from retired judges, military veterans, former federal employees. Some were short, just a line or two. Others were pages long, recounting their own moments of humiliation, of being dismissed, of biting their tongue when someone spoke down to them. But each one, in its own way, said the same thing. Thank you for saying what we couldn't. In Crockett's hometown, a local radio station held a call-in segment for older listeners to react to the hearing. Call after call came through. That young woman, said a 70-year-old truck driver from Houston, she reminded me what courage looks like. A retired Marine added, she didn't raise her voice, didn't call names, she just held the line. That's how you know someone's telling the truth. In classrooms, teachers paused their government lessons to replay her words. In legal circles, professors used her as a case study in cross-examination under pressure. In faith groups, pastors referenced her poise as a reminder that integrity doesn't require volume, it requires conviction. And through it all, Crockett stayed grounded. No interviews, no rallies, no self-congratulations, just the quiet rhythm of service. She returned to committee meetings, met with constituents, voted on legislation. In her words, the moment was never about me. It was about what we should all expect from the people we trust to speak truth under oath. Patel, meanwhile, faded from the public eye. The committees opened formal reviews into his testimony. Legal analysts across the board agreed the contradictions Crockett exposed would be hard to explain under further scrutiny. He didn't reappear on television. Invitations to speak at conferences were rescinded quietly. The once unshakable image of a man above questioning was now irrevocably cracked. But the bigger shift was happening at the cultural level, because what Jasmine Crockett had done wasn't just dismantle a witness. She had reshaped a narrative. In a time when so much of political discourse had become about shouting, she proved that quiet could be lethal. That preparation beats performance. That the truth, when carried with dignity, can cut deeper than any insult. And in doing so, she lit a match, not to burn, but to illuminate. Older Americans, those who had lived through decades of political promise and political failure, felt something in that moment. Not just satisfaction, but hope. Hope that the system could still produce leaders who weren't chasing applause, but standing for accountability. Hope that facts could still matter, that lies could still have consequences. At a church in Georgia, the pastor read her words from the pulpit. "I may be new to Congress, but I've spent enough time in courtrooms to recognize perjury when I see it." He let the silence follow. Then he said, "Let that be a lesson, not just for DC, but for us all. Speak truth, even when the room doesn't want to hear it." And perhaps that's what made the moment more than just political. It became moral. Crockett's delivery wasn't about ideology. It was about integrity. Her strength didn't come from anger. It came from discipline, from clarity, from knowing that when someone tries to obscure the truth, your job isn't to match their volume. It's to anchor yourself in fact and let it speak for you. And that's exactly what she did. By the following week, Crockett's quote had been printed on posters, shared on t-shirts, highlighted in local newsletters. Seniors at a retirement center in Pennsylvania held a discussion night around it. Veterans groups cited her moment in ethics training seminars. She had become more than a voice in a hearing. She had become a signal that the fight for accountability wasn't just alive, it had a pulse again. So, if you're watching this and wondering whether truth still has power in Washington, remember this moment. If you've ever been underestimated, interrupted, or dismissed, remember this voice. And if you believe that honesty, clarity, and courage still belong in public service, then this story is yours too. Like this video if it inspired you. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever had to stand your ground when someone tried to silence you? And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more moments that remind us all, in a world full of noise, truth still echoes.